Alright, hello 7th graders. Today we're going to be reading a new story called New Gumption. This story by Russel Baker is an autobiography, and an autobiography is something that an author writes about their real life. It might not be the whole story of their life, but most of it. This right here is something we call an autobiographical sketch, which means it's just a brief outline of one part of the author's life. It's not the whole thing. So, this story takes place in 1929, which was during the Great Depression. So keep that in mind as you read it. The Great Depression, remember, was a time when lots of people were having money issues because the economy was not doing so well. So any money that their family could get was really, really helpful. And even if it was a child of the family that was going out and doing some kind of job, the family was eager to get that sort of assistance. So keep that in mind as we read this story. All I need from you is when I ask for it, for you to define a vocab word that comes up in our story. And you can choose the definition from the list on Edpuzzle that will come up when I ask the question. You can use Google, you can use a dictionary, you can use your book, you can ask a parent what the word means. All I need is for you to find the correct definition of the word when I ask for it. Okay, so let's begin. This is No Gumption by Russel Baker. I began working in journalism when I was 8 years old. It was my mother's idea. She wanted me to make something of myself, and after a level-headed appraisal of my strengths, decided I had better start young if I was to have any chance of keeping up with the competition. The flaw in my character, which she had already spotted, was my lack of gumption. Okay, already we're at our first word. So, I'd like you to Google, look in the dictionary, look in your book, find out what is the definition of gumption. Alright, hopefully you wrote determination or initiative, or maybe another word could be motivation. The stories in this section of our unit are going to be all about gumption and motivation. So keep that in mind as we read forward as well. Okay, let's see. Yes, so she had already spotted his lack of gumption. My idea of a perfect afternoon was lying in front of the radio, rereading my favorite Big Little book, Dick Tracy Meets Stooge Viller. My mother despised inactivity. Seeing me have a good time in repose, she was powerless to hide her disgust. "You've got no more gumption than a bump on a log," she said. "Get out in the kitchen and help Doris do those dirty dishes." My sister Doris, though 2 years younger than I, had enough gumption for a dozen people. She positively enjoyed washing dishes, making beds, and cleaning the house. When she was only 7, she could carry a piece of short-weighted cheese back to the A&P, threaten the manager with legal action, and come back triumphantly with the full quarter-pounder we'd paid for, and a few ounces extra thrown in for forgiveness. Doris could have made something of herself if she hadn't been a girl. Because of this defect, however, the best she could hope for was a career as a nurse or a school teacher, the only work that capable females were considered up to in those days. Alright, so we've come a lot further than we have since then. Okay, this must have saddened my mother, this twist of fate that had allocated all the gumption to the daughter and left her with a son who was content with Dick Tracy and Stooge Viller. If disappointed, though, she wasted no energy on self-pity. She would make me something of myself whether I wanted to or not. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," she said. That was the way her mind worked. She was realistic about the difficulty. Having sized up the material the Lord had given her to mold, she didn't overestimate what she could do with it. She didn't insist that I grow up to be President of the United States. 50 years ago, parents still asked boys if they wanted to grow up to be president, and asked it not jokingly, but seriously. Many parents who were hardly more than paupers still believed their sons could do it. Abraham Lincoln had done it. We were only 65 years from Lincoln. Many a grandfather who walked among us could remember Lincoln's time. Men of grandfatherly age were the worst for asking if you wanted to grow up to be president. A surprising number of little boys said yes and meant it. I was asked myself many times. No, I would say, I didn't want to grow up to be president. My mother was present during one of these interrogations. An elderly uncle, having posed the usual questions and exposed my lack of interest in the presidency, asked, "Well, what do you want to be when you grow up?" I love to pick through trash piles and collect empty bottles, tin cans with pretty labels, and discarded magazines. The most desirable job on earth sprang instantly to mind. I want to be a garbage man, I said. My uncle smiled, but my mother had seen the first distressing evidence of a bump budding on a log. Have a little gumption, Russell, she said. Her calling me Russell was a sign of unhappiness. When she approved of me, I was always Buddy. When I turned 8 years old, she decided that the job of starting me on the road toward making something of myself could no longer be safely delayed. Buddy, she said one day, I want you to come home right after school this afternoon. Somebody's coming, and I want you to meet him. When I burst in that afternoon, she was in conference in the parlor with an executive of the Curtis Publishing Company. She introduced me. He bent low from the waist and shook my hand. Was it true, as my mother had told him, he asked, that I longed for the opportunity to conquer the world of business? My mother replied that I was blessed with a rare determination to make something of myself. Do you recognize that word, determination? That's a synonym for our earlier word, gumption. All right. That's right, I whispered. But have you got the grit, the character, the never-say-quit spirit it takes to succeed in business? My mother said I certainly did. That's right, I said. He eyed me silently for a long pause, as though weighing whether I could be trusted to keep his confidence, then spoke man to man. Before taking a crucial step, he said, he wanted to advise me that working for the Curtis Publishing Company placed enormous responsibility on a young man. Okay, let's back up in that sentence. I would like you to look up the word crucial and tell me what it means. Remember, you can use Google, your book, or a dictionary. All right, hopefully you found that crucial means important or critical. So this man is saying that, the author is saying that before taking this critical step, this important step, the man wanted to make sure that he knew how much of a responsibility it was to work for his company. All right, let's move forward. So, it was one of the great companies of America, perhaps the greatest publishing house in the world. I had heard, no doubt, of the Saturday Evening Post. Heard of it? My mother said that everyone in our house had heard of the Saturday Post, and that I, in fact, read it with religious devotion. Then, doubtless, he said, we were also familiar with those two monthly pillars of the magazine world, the Ladies' Home Journal and the Country Gentleman. Indeed, we were familiar with them, said my mother. Representing the Saturday Evening Post was one of the weightiest honors that could be bestowed in the world of business, he said. He was personally proud of being part of that great corporation. My mother said he had every right to be. Again he studied me, as though debating whether I was worthy of a knighthood. Finally, are you trustworthy? My mother said I was the soul of honesty. That's right, I said. The caller smiled for the first time. He told me I was a lucky young man. He admired my spunk. Too many young men thought life was all play. Those young men would not go far in this world. Only a young man willing to work and save and keep his face washed and his hair neatly combed could hope to come out on top in a world such as ours. Did I truly and sincerely believe that I was such a young man? He certainly does, said my mother. That's right, I said. He said he had been so impressed by what he had seen of me that he was going to make me a representative of the Curtis Publishing Company. On the following Tuesday, he said, 30 freshly printed copies of the Saturday Evening Post would be delivered at our door. I would place these magazines, still damp with the ink of the presses, in a handsome canvas bag, sling it over my shoulder, and set forth through the streets to bring the best in journalism, fiction, and cartoons to the American public. He had brought the canvas bag with him. He presented it with reverence fit for a chasuble. I'll tell you right now, chasuble is a sleeveless outer garment worn by priests. So what he's basically saying is that this man who came to ask him to be a delivery boy gave him the bag with reverence, the same reverence he would treat a priest with or a pastor with. Okay. He showed me how to drape the sling over my left shoulder and across the chest so that the pouch lay easily accessible to my right hand, allowing the best in journalism, fiction, and cartoons to be swiftly extracted and sold to a citizenry whose happiness and security depended upon us, the soldiers of the free press. The following Tuesday, I raced home from school. put the canvas bag over my shoulder, dumped the magazines in, and, tilting to the left to balance their weight on my right hip, embarked on the highway of journalism. We lived in Bellevue, New Jersey, a commuter town at the northern fringe of Newark. It was 1932, the bleakest year of the Depression. My father had died 2 years before, leaving us with a few pieces of Sears Roebuck furniture, and not much else. And my mother had taken Doris and me to live with one of her younger brothers. This was my Uncle Allen. Uncle Allen had made something of himself by 1932. As salesman for a soft drink bottler in Newark, he had an income of $30 a week, wore pearl gray spats, detachable collars, and a three-piece suit, was happily married, and took in threadbare relatives. With my load of magazines, I headed toward Belleville Avenue. That's where the people were. There were two filling stations at the intersection with Union Avenue, as well as an A&P, a fruit stand, a bakery, a barber shop, Zuccarelli's drugstore, and a diner shaped like a railroad car. For several hours I made myself highly visible, shifting position now and then from corner to corner, from shop window to shop window, to make sure everyone could see the heavy black lettering on the canvas bag that said the Saturday Evening Post. When the angle of the light indicated it was supper time, I walked back to the house. "How many did you sell, buddy?" my mother asked. "None." "Where did you go?" "The corner of Bellevue and Union Avenues." "What did you do?" "Stood on the corner waiting for somebody to buy a Saturday Evening Post." "You just stood there. Didn't sell a single one." "Oh, for gosh sakes, Russell." Uncle Allen intervened. "I've been thinking about it for some time," he said, "and I've about decided to take the Post regularly. Put me down as a regular customer." I handed him a magazine, and he paid me a nickel. It was the first nickel I earned. Afterwards, my mother instructed me in salesmanship. I would have to ring doorbells, address adults with charming self-confidence, and break down resistance with a sales talk pointing out that no one, no matter how poor, could afford to be without the Saturday Evening Post in the home. I told my mother I had changed my mind about wanting to succeed in the magazine business. "If you think I'm going to raise a good-for-nothing," she replied, "you've got another thing coming." She told me to hit the streets with the canvas bag and start ringing doorbells the instant school was out the next day. When I objected that I didn't feel any aptitude for salesmanship, she asked how I'd like to lend her my leather belt so she could whack some sense into me. All right, aptitude is the word I'd like you to look up right now. So use either Google, a dictionary, or search on or look in your book to see what does aptitude mean. All right, aptitude means talent or ability. I don't know if you've ever heard of an aptitude test, but that's like a test people take to see what kind of job they might have in the future. So, when he writes, "When I objected that I didn't feel any aptitude for salesmanship," he's saying he didn't feel like he could be a salesman. All right. I bowed to superior will and entered journalism with a heavy heart. My mother and I had fought this battle almost as long as I could remember. It probably started even before memory began, when I was a country child in Northern Virginia, and my mother, dissatisfied with my father's plain workman life, determined that I would not grow up like him and his people. With calluses on their hands, overalls on their backs, and fourth-grade educations in their heads, she had fancier ideas of life's possibilities, introducing me to the Saturday Evening Post. She was trying to wean me as early as possible from my father's world, where men left with lunch pails at sunup worked with their hands until the grime ate into the pores and died with a few sticks of mail-order furniture as their legacy. In my mother's vision of the better life, there were desks and white collars, well-pressed suits, evenings of reading and lively talk, and perhaps, if a man were very, very lucky and hit the jackpot, really made something important of himself, perhaps there might be a fantastic salary of $5,000 a year to support a big house and a Buick with a rumble seat and a vacation in Atlantic City.